Good evening and welcome to the fifth session of the Hunter to Hunter Connective Conversations webinar. Tonight I'm pleased to introduce Jeannine Schweihofer and Tina Conklin, who will talk about safe home processing. As we're moving through this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop those in the question and answer chat pod. And we'll field those as we go and definitely by the end of the webinar. Just a small reminder that we have extended the webinar series one more week to have focus groups and dialogue next week on Wednesday at 7 p.m. I'll be sending out the link for that so that it's a webinar meeting instead of a regular webinar presentation. So we hope that you all can join us in that and share what your thoughts and feelings on further outreach and education around CWD can be as we move forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeannine and Tina.
Thanks, Katie. I want to take a moment to introduce myself and my colleague, Jeannine. Jeannine and I both work in the meat industry. We've spent many years there collectively, and we love the idea of at-home venison processing. We think that this is a very important topic this year in particular because of the supply chain issues that we've had, and we think that this will be very timely and look forward to some conversation at the end of the presentation. So to go over what we're going to talk about this evening, we're going to talk about carcass cleaning, storage, and handling. And I want to tell all of you that we started this series assuming that you field dressed your carcass and you've gotten it home. So that's the point that we're going to start at. Now, if we need to discuss field dressing, we're happy to do so at the end of the presentation, and we can take questions then. But we also, I don't know if Katie has discussed or not, we are going to have some YouTube videos coming out that are going to show field dressing and most of the topics that we're covering with you this evening so that you can call those up on your phone and take a look at them again as you need them. We're going to go over some safety considerations when you're doing your at-home processing. We're going to look at cutting and grinding venison. We're going to talk about packaging wild game for the freezer. And then we're going to look at further processing for jerky and sausages. So to get started, we're going to start with hanging your deer carcass. The goal here is to keep it cold. We want to target being less than 40 degrees on the carcass. It's important because we want to stop the growth of microorganisms if they're present in the carcass, or in the carcass cavity. And I want to talk here a minute about the importance of not having to hang your deer for a week at a time in order to make that meat tender. A young deer carcass does not need to be hung for very long at all. At home, when I do my venison, I hang it for maybe a day. We don't have a lot of age on the venison around here. Typically what we shoot is only about 2.5 to 3.5 years old. So I'll hang it for a day before we start processing it. You can hang it longer if weather conditions permit. If your work schedule doesn't allow for you to process it, then you can hang it longer, but you're not required to hang it. We recommend limiting the hanging of older deer carcasses for 3 to 5 days. Ideally, you want to be between 35 and 37 degrees Fahrenheit when that's hanging. Go ahead, Jeannine. There's 2 different ways that you can hang a deer carcass. You can hang it from the head area, hang it head up, or you can hang it by a gambrel with the head down. If you look at the picture on the left with the heads up, you'll notice that they're not actually tied by the head. They have that strap around the base of the antlers. If you're going to taxidermy this animal, I would recommend that you don't hang it around the neck area. You're going to damage you're going to damage the carcass itself, you're going to damage the fur, and you're going to end up with a European mount versus a shoulder mount. So don't be disappointed here. So hang it properly. Hanging it on a buck pole or hanging it by the head, they've actually strapped it around both antlers to have equal pressure on there. Now, I prefer hanging with a gambrel by the hind legs so that the head is down. This is how we process all livestock in our meat plant, and this is just the way that I'm used to working with them. We're going to talk a little bit more about when we're skinning and when we're cooling the carcass or needing to keep the carcass cool, but this is sometimes an advantageous angle to have your deer at. Go ahead, Jeannine. When we get that carcass home and get it hung up, we want to rinse that carcass cavity. I take the hose and I rinse it out with pressurized water, cold water. And cold water will not cause the inside of that carcass cavity to spoil faster. It's good to, you can have blood, you could have popped the bladder, you could pop an intestine, so you could have fecal, you could have ingesta, you could have blood inside there, and it will start to dry. So using that pressure with cold water is going to help help you rinse out that cavity. Then what we like to do is make a salt water solution to wash the interior of the carcass. And we recommend that you take a half a cup of salt per gallon of tepid water, mix it in, and then we use paper towels to wipe out the inside of that carcass. If you've ever cleaned in between the carcass, the ribs, in between the ribs or at the end of the rib bones are very sharp. So get in there, clean up around the pelvic area of the deer, and make sure that you have it nice and cleaned out. And the saltwater solution is a very good step to take to reduce any additional microbial growth that you may have. We're going to take care when we skin so that we avoid spreading the hair everywhere on the carcass. There's nothing worse than when you're starting to skin and you get a good clean carcass and then you chase these rampant hairs all around the carcass and you're constantly picking them off. So it's a very frustrating thing to have to deal with, but it's just part of it. And again, the time of the year that you are harvesting and the weather conditions really have a lot to do with how long those hairs are on that when you're skinning. And so right now, this time of year, if you're going to go bow hunting, we don't have a lot of winter winter fur hair on that animal. And so it's a little bit easier in the skinning process than if you get a late season deer and then you're skinning a pretty thick coat there. Go ahead, Jeannine. Sorry, Jeannine is driving and I am simply she's my Vanna and I'm asking her to advance the slides. So I talked earlier about how long you hang the carcass and that a young deer doesn't need to be hung as long. One way to determine this is to dentition the deer. And so for those of you who have never done this before, we have a link up here on this page that shows you a bulletin from Texas. That's a very nice bulletin that describes how to dentition the deer and how to actually look at it. What I have here are some photos that I want to go over. Can I share my, can I share my screen?
We can see you in the presenter box.
You can see me, so, okay.
So you don't need to share your screen, just your video is
all
up.
Right. So can I go speaker view, full screen? Anyhow. What I wanted to show was this is the deer head that is on the right, or excuse me, the left center photo. So this is a doe head that I found out in the woods. And I want to look at this and I want to dentition this. And if we zoom in, we're going to look at this little tooth right here. This molar here, although these others are missing. This one is telling me an awful lot about this deer. She's not very old. There's not a lot of wear on any of the teeth here. So I know that she's a fairly young deer, although she has all 6 molars that have come through. In contrast, if I take this deer, this skull here, which, let's see, yep, was tagged correctly, just in case anybody's wondering. If we look at this and we look at the inside here, we'll see that these same molars that we looked at in that doe, this buck has a lot of wear in here, so he's an older animal. So we might want to hang this carcass a little bit longer. But what I did also want to point out is that the way that these molars look can be a little bit deceptive. If you think about what this is going to look like when you're looking at it, when there's actually skin up to these teeth, they look like there's far more teeth there than there are. I want you to know that these back molars that they have are actually quite large. So they are about a half an inch. Can I get that? They're about a half an inch wide. And when we look at them like this, they can look like they are two different molars, when in fact they're really one. So I want people to be aware that there are 6 adult teeth with them. So we can go on then to the next slide. Storing the carcass until you're going to process it. Again, we want to keep it cold, always less than 40 degrees. There's different things that we can do. You can take clean ice bags in the cavity. You do this to rapidly cool the carcass down. So I would, if you're going to pick up the ice bags, wipe the surface of them with an antimicrobial wipe. You can leave the ice in the bag. Always leave the ice in the bag. We really don't want to soak that meat. We just want to use the ice to get the carcass cold. You can put the bag into another food grade bag. I do this often. Don't use those dark trash bags because they're not always sanitary on the inside. You want to keep the water off the inside of the carcass. If you field dress and you split the ribs and the sternum, and then you've gone all the way up to the esophagus and the windpipe, you might want to put a strapper loosely around the chest. And that's usually why, again, another reason that I hang from a gambrel, hang with the head down, because I've sort of made a funnel. So I can tuck that bag of ice in and keep it from sliding out. Or if I'm propping that carcass open and I'm using a stick, that's a nice place to rest a bag of ice, and it'll sit in there quite nice. But we want to use that ice to keep that carcass cold, or to bring the temperature of that carcass down. You can use buckets, sometimes smaller buckets, if you think about just small feed buckets that you can use and fill those with ice and keep refilling them with ice to keep that carcass cold or bring that temperature down. Go ahead, Jeannine. There's hide on versus hide off opinions. I personally usually cool with the hide on. That gives me protection from dust and dirt. I don't hang inside. I don't hang in my garage. I hang out in the shop. So it actually, I think, keeps the carcass a lot cleaner. There are people, of course, it will cool down faster because you don't have that hide present. So the meat will cool down faster if it's cold outside. But you'll also get some drying out of the carcass, and you can you'll get some loss, some moisture loss on that carcass when you do that. Be sure that you remove those tenderloins on the inside that are found on the inside of the deer right below the rib cage. These, I do this before I even cool the carcass. I just pull them out. They seem to be what we eat every evening after we've had a successful hunt. And it's usually very fun to take those out and be ready for the processing the next day. You can also, if you have space in your cooler or your refrigerator, remove the large cuts or quarter that. And I have a big enough chest freezer that if I didn't have it full, I could quarter out a deer, and I could skin it, quarter it out, and I could lay it out in my chest freezer to get it good and cold if I wanted to. If I had the room to do it. My chest freezer is large enough. Not everybody has that. You may have a refrigerator in your garage that you could do that with, and put the put the quarters on the shelves of a garage refrigerator. Jeannine, did you have anything to add here?
You could also store them in a bucket. So I think the previous comment on the slide before for using a bucket, there's food grade buckets, and you can pick them up at any home supply store. And they may also help you store larger pieces of the deer meat, the venison.
Right. Yep.
So
Next slide.
we're going to talk about skinning the deer now. And if you've got it hanging by the gambrel, as Tina and I prefer, but it's obviously not the only way. But we like to do it that way because we can just use a knife to get our pelt started. And then there's a foul membrane in there. And you can kind of get your thumb in there after you've made those cuts, and you just start peeling that hide off and separate it with that foul membrane in there, and use the weight of the hide as it's coming down, and you just keep rolling it down and pulling it down. If you're doing it right and all things are going well, most of the time you'll need very little knife interaction once you've started the knife cuts at the front. You'll need to cut where these dotted lines are, down the legs, and then once you start in that quarter area, you're going to be good to go. We want to cut the front legs off there as well. We don't cut the hind legs off at that point though, because we want to keep that carcass hanging to give us some leverage as we're skinning the deer, and then later on as we're working to cut it up or fabricate it. So some safety considerations while we're doing skinning and processing at home. They make what we call cut resistant gloves. They're not cut proof. You still can cut yourself. But they're like a metal mesh glove. And if you put them on the opposite hand that you hold your knife in, it will prevent you from getting your fingers and hands cut throughout the process. We have several different knives here. We have a breaking knife, we have a skinning knife, and we have a boning knife. My two favorite knives for this process would be a boning knife and a breaking knife. Again, you could use the skinning knife if you have one, but it's not necessary to have one because really you're making very few cuts between that hide and that foul membrane. So it's important to have personal protective equipment like these cut resistant gloves. You can also put disposable gloves on over those, some cotton gloves if you want to add some warmth, and then put disposable gloves on top of those. And then you want to clean the work area before and after processing. And so you can do that with hot, warm, soapy water, but you want to clear everything off of the workspace. So if you're working in your house, in the kitchen, get everything else out of there that's there for a day-to-day use, and sort of clear your working space. And also make sure that your knife stays clean throughout the process. And you can do that by washing it in between, or some people have a couple of different knives that they may use. So as you prepare that workspace and clean the counter spot, you can use either a large polyethylene, it's like these white, thick cutting board type material boards, or if you don't have one of those that's large enough, you could use a clean sheet of plywood, wash it off with a bleach and water solution, and then rinse that bleach and water solution off and let it dry prior to using it. That's not as ideal, but it is an option if you don't have a large polyethylene cutting board. So when we cut the deer carcass, we want to be ruthless about trimming contaminated areas. And what we mean by that is if there's hair, if there's fecal matter, if there's gunshot, buckshot, any of that residue, anything that's questionable, go ahead and trim that off and discard that. We also want to avoid cutting through the spinal cord and through that spinal column, because as you've learned in this webinar series, CWD is based a neurological disease that's based on prions, and that spinal cord is where those prions would be located. That would be not something we want to recommend cutting through. We also want to avoid cutting through the lymph nodes, and I have slides in the next couple of slides that have some pretty good pictures of lymph nodes. They're usually in this elbow pocket, and that's where those lymph nodes are. So you want to avoid cutting through those. All of this can be done without a saw. You can cut these front legs off. There's like a break joint in there, and so you just look for the bone and cartilage junction, and you can kind of break that leg down a little bit. And if you cut the knife and then break it off further and then just cut that front leg off, you don't even need a saw at that point. In general, when we're cutting meat, we want to separate thick from thin cuts or tender from less tender cuts. So the thinner cuts are usually more tender, and our thicker cuts are usually less tender. So here's another close-up of where these lymph nodes are going to be located in that elbow pocket and beyond, and you can see that there's some natural seams. You want to follow those natural seams wherever you're trying to separate muscles throughout this cutting process. Here's a close-up of a lymph node in that shoulder area. And then here's 3 more that are closely located, and we want to avoid cutting through those just because that's where some diseases can be concentrated, and we don't want to spread them throughout the rest of our meat. You can see that there is some hair contamination on this, and so we would want to be cutting that apart and keeping our hands clean or our gloves clean, and things like that. So individual cuts that we will get out of a venison carcass or a deer carcass, most of the meat in the leg, so this is the rear part of the animal, the hind part of the animal, this is the fore part, or where the neck and head would be attached. Again, this is a half of a carcass on a side, but if we turned that at us, you can follow a knife, and I like to, we've already removed our tenderloin. You can just go up in there and you'll see those back straps, oops, laying right up in there when you are cooling that carcass. But then I like to go on the outside of the carcass, and I like to start cutting here, right here between the hind quarter or the hind end and the loin area. And I just sort of cut across, and then I go right down the middle of that next to the spinal column, but without going in there. And you'll be going through ribs and vertebrae as vertebrae throughout, and then rib closer to the bottom or the front of the carcass. But you can pull out some good muscles here, the longissimus muscle, that work really well for venison chops or venison off the ribs and the spare ribs as well. We can bone in between them and get extra meat out if you want to grind them, put that into your trim for grind. The same can be true for the flank. Usually that is ground off of a deer. And then that front shoulder that we had pictures of before, where the lymph nodes were, there's lots of muscles laying in and on top of each other. That works really well for stew meat. You could make a shoulder roast, boneless roast, and tie it up and put it in a net, or use a string and tie it around. Or you could just make it into trim and use it for ground venison. Up in the hind, the round, there's areas for, again, some larger steaks or roasts, and you can bone out leg bone. So that leg bone going to be laying in here and coming in with the hip and the pelvic bone. And you can cut out all of these muscles. And then once you get them cut out, you can cut them into individual steaks or chops. And you can also put them in a little thicker cuts and do roasts. And you can do medallions, or you can do butterfly chops where you cut a steak or a chop that is twice as wide. And then you cut about 3/4 of the way down through that. And you open that up and it gives you a larger serving and a little bit bigger steak, but it's still then about, you know, that 3/4 to maybe a little bit more of an inch thick for a good steak. So those are the different cuts. And any of the trim you can put into grind. And Tina's going to talk about that. You're muted, Tina. Try *6, Tina.
Yep, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, when we look at grinding, we're going to cube the meat for grinding. We're going to get it into workable pieces for our grinders that we have in our home. We're going to develop a crust on them because the colder the meat, the better that it grinds, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But first, we're going to put together our grinder properly. And if we look at this diagram here, you see that you have the auger, you have the blades, and you have the plate, and then the collar. New grinders, the grinders that they make nowadays, are very difficult to put together wrong because they make, usually on the grinder itself, the housing of the grinder, they make a little tab that the plate fits on, and the plate will go on last. And so it can't be assembled differently. Old style grinders do not have that. So you could, on an older grinder, put the plate on before you put the blade on. And if you do that, you'll be disappointed because your grinder is going to just keep backing up. There's no action there to push that meat through there. So that blade isn't cutting. What I have here is a very old version of a grinder. And you see that the way that this one works is that my blade here is attached to the outside. The reason that this design isn't popular any longer. And then we put that back on there. And then there's a wing nut that fits on here to hold that blade in place. And then you grind through. And as a kid, I made a lot of bologna sandwiches with this one. So it works. It's a little rough, but you know, this is another design that they have. Again, it's hard to put it together wrong. And the blades that they have on here, this would be my coarse grind blade. But I could, let's see here, hang on. This coarse grind blade has 3 knives on it. But if I wanted to do some very fine grind, if I wanted to grind a little bit finer, I would use this blade. And then if I really wanted to grind fine, I could put this blade on it. And that's how that one works. Go ahead, Jeannine. We want to keep the throat of the grinder full all the time. That's why they give you those little push bars that you can put into these automated grinders now. It's to keep some pressure on there to keep meat moving through. Or as it sits in front of that blade, it's just going to heat up and it's going to fat out for you, and it's going to stop up your grinder a bit. The typical blades that we have, you see that Jeannine has a picture of a lot of different plates and blades over here. But typically for plate sizes, we run an 1/8, a 3/16, and a 3/30 or 5/32. Those are the most common type sizes of plates that we have. Most of the home grinders that we have now are either a 3 or a 4 wing blade that they have on them. And it's really one set piece. You don't have separate blades that you're putting in and out. You can sharpen the edges of those blades that are on there. You can look at them. If you're running a lot of cartilage through there, you may get some nicks on it, and you may want to just have them sharpened out. And you can do that on a regular stone if you want to sharpen them up. some, but they do a really good job. They're nice hardened steel, and so they perform well for home grinders. Go ahead, next slide. One of the key parts of grinding your venison is going to be keeping your trimmings cold. So what I do when we have our trimmings together is that we take baking sheets or cake pans, depends on how much we have, and I try to expose as much of the surface of the meat as possible. And I put a little light layer of saran wrap on there, and then I tuck it into my freezer. If it's my chest freezer, I roll it, I lay them out there on the top of that chest freezer. If it's the stand-up freezer, I just put one on each shelf. And if you're using a thin cake pan, you can usually tuck it in above whatever you have in that freezer. And that puts a nice chill on the meat. And the colder that I keep the meat, not frozen, but having that hard chill on the meat, say 35, 37 degrees, even colder, you could go 32 and it would be cold on the surface, you can get a better grind. The meat's going to look better when it comes out of that grinder for you when you have it that cold. So then I only bring it up or out of my freezer as I need it. I don't stack up my whole counter with all of it and then try to grind it all. That's the benefit of having kids, is that they can run and go get those sheet trays for you as you need to bring them out, or vice versa. Once they like running the grinder, you can be the one that's going up and down the steps to the freezer to get those sheet trays. Then what I do, next slide if we want to. If you want to add suet to your product, then what I do when I grind is that I'll coarse grind first. So I'll use my largest plate that I have and I'll do a coarse grind. And then I'll take suet and beef suet, and I pick it up from my butcher shop. It comes in it looks like this. This is my suet that I have. But what I did is I want to show you, putting suet in your grinder is only going to stop it up. You're going to smear up your grinder. If you're running straight suet through there, it's not going to end well for you. You're going to be a little bit frustrated with it. So here's what a piece of suet looks like, and here's how easy it is to break it up. I can literally, by hand if I want to, make very small pieces out of that suet. So it's easy to take a knife and just chop it much finer. You're not going to notice it when you grind it. What I do then is I have it in nice small particles, and I combine it with my coarse ground venison, and then what I'll do is put it in a big pot, and I mix it 10 pounds of venison. I'll put 1 pound of suet in. And that's just my easy math to keep up with. I have a little scale there. I'll put it in a bigger pot, and I'll hand mix it. And then I'll take and I'll lay it out on my sheet trays again, pop it back into the freezer for a little bit, check on it. When I have a nice crust on there, that gives me time to clean out my grinder again. I'll clean my plates and my blades and get the auger clean. And then I'll set it up again, and I'll run all that venison back through there again. And then that suet is mixed in nice with my grind, with my coarse grind, and I've made a nice grind that I like working with that then makes a nice burger. It's going to make great taco meat or meatloaf. And if I want to, at that point, when I put it in my pot, I can add seasonings to it, and I can make a venison breakfast sausage, or I can make a bratwurst or Italian sausage, hot or mild Italian sausage, and have it mixed there. If I want to further take it and put it into a stuffer, I can do that, or I can just put it and keep it as chub meat if I need to, if I want to do that. Next slide.
You can also add pork fat. Tina, you want to talk about that?
Oh, yes. And I'm sorry, I don't add pork fat typically to mine, so I'm sorry. Thank you, Jeannine. But you can do the same thing. You can go to your local butcher shop and you can get pork fat, and you can add it the same way as you do the suet. The suet is from beef. The pork fat obviously is from pig. And it just helps give you a little extra fat with the meat if that's what you want to do. There's certainly no requirement to do it. We do it about 50% of the time. I tend to like to add the suet or the pork fat to it if I'm going to use that product, it holds together better if I'm making a burger, really helps bind it, or for taco meat. So, you know, it's a personal preference. Some people are purists and they don't want to add suet or pork fat to any of it, and that's fine. It's just an option that's out there. And I think that sometimes when you add the pork fat or the suet, it helps with the flavor uptake of a brat seasoning or an Italian seasoning. It kind of helps pick up your flavors a little bit better.
So now you've gone to all this work to cut up and or grind your venison, your fresh venison, and you have more meat than you can use in the amount of time that it will stay fresh, which is typically, you know, maybe 3 to 5 days, probably closer to 2 to 3 days if it's a fresh ground venison. So we want to make sure that you package it correctly. There's tons of different packaging options out there. Some of them involve a little more technology and a few more dollars. There's at-home vacuum packagers, and that they make rolls of bags, and you kind of just rip the bags off as you go, put the meat in there, put the edge of the bag in this little at-home vacuum packager. You press start on the machine and it runs a vacuum and it sucks all of the air out. That is the best form of packaging for freezer storage that's out there and available. And it's now fairly affordable to do that in an at-home situation. If you don't have a vacuum packager, there's freezer paper, freezer bags, and you can put the meat in the freezer bag, manually push out all of the air and get the meat in close contact with that bag surface. And then after you've sealed that bag, you can wrap it in freezer paper or white butcher paper. They make larger rolls at stores like GFS and Sam's Club and Costco. They also work great for craft projects and other things where you need large sheets of paper to protect surfaces and things like that. So it does come in larger rolls than the one depicted here in the picture. You can also use freezer paper in combination with a saran wrap. And so in that case, I would recommend wrapping the meat in saran wrap. Again, getting that saran wrap in close contact with the meat so that we're avoiding creating freezer burn. We're trying to minimize the amount of ice crystals that will form when you freeze it. And after you wrap it with saran wrap, then you can wrap it in that freezer paper tightly. You can just do freezer paper or the plastic freezer bags by themselves. Either of those are options. You'll just get a little bit less time before that freezer burn, or you'll get more freezer burn that forms in a more rapid time frame. You can easily, if you package wild game well, store venison for 6 to 12 months in a freezer. So when you're freezing it, our home freezers, whether it's an upright freezer or chest freezer, they're not really made to freeze food. They're made to keep frozen food frozen. And so the faster you can freeze something, the higher quality meat you're gonna end up with and less freezer burn. So if you can have a freezer that's not completely full, lay it out. If you have more than one of these racks, and you can lay some of the packages in that and get airflow around it as the meat is freezing, that is ideal. And then after your meat freezes, you can repackage it and get it more neatly organized and packed into your freezer to maximize the frozen space. When you're preparing your venison, we want to think about safety. And so any ground meat, whether that be ground beef, ground pork, should be cooked to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can use a rapid thermometer, like a digital thermometer here, or you can use a dial thermometer that measures the internal temperature of that meat. You also want to think about what cuts are more tender and would use dry heat cookery, such as steaks, and then which cuts would benefit from some moist heat cookery, low, slow, and with a little bit of moisture, some sort of liquid, and that would be things like roasts and cuts from the shoulder and the hind end. You can also think about making further processed meats like jerky, snack sticks, sausages. They could be fully cooked products like that, or it could be like the Italian sausages and different products Tina was talking about. There's a ton of pre-mixed spice packets out there for some of these further processed products, and most of them really work quite well. When you're making a product like a jerky or a summer sausage or something like that, most often that has what we call cure salt or pink salt, which is sodium nitrite. Usually this salt is at about 6.25% of the sodium nitrite, and the rest, the 93.25% is carried with salt. They color it pink so that you're not inadvertently mistaking it for pure salt, pure sugar, or something like that. These pre-mixed spice packets typically come with that pink salt in a separate pouch and will have specific instructions for when to add that. If you add it at the wrong time, it could flash out and not be stabilized, and then you won't get the effect of the curing. So if you mix those spices together and store them with that pink salt, you're not going to get the benefit of that cure salt. The other things to note with when making jerky is that they really can be a food safety hazard if they're not made properly. So we don't want to just use a food dehydrator and dry that meat out, because there could be microbial pathogens like E. coli that survive, even though it's a thin product. There's no thermal lethality, so there's no kill step. There's no heat to destroy those pathogens like we want. Years ago, there were recipes to just put it in an oven as low as you could get your oven and leave the door cracked and let it cook for 2 or 3 days, right? That's not ideal either. Really, it's important when you're making jerky yourself, if you're using one of those at-home smokers, or if you're trying to do it in the oven, you want to reach lethality first. And that lethality temperature would be 165 degrees Fahrenheit before you start to dry out the meat. If you can include some sort of water to create some sort of humidity in that cooking process, that's even better. And you really want it to be at 165 degrees with that humidity added for about an hour or a little more than an hour before you start to remove that water and dry that meat out the rest of the way. Other things you can make, snack sticks, sausages, salamis. Some of those go in a casing, and they make stuffer attachments for some of these commercial at-home grinders. There's hand crank sausage stuffers where the stuffing horn goes on and you load the casing on, or even some smaller size at-home kitchen mixers have grinding and stuffer attachments that work fairly well. You could also do it in bulk. And if you're using a casing, cellulose casings are probably easier to work with than natural casings. They're readily available at meat supply stores. Your local butcher may be able to hook you up, and they're online, and sporting goods stores, of course, sell them as well. So there's a resource that we have. It's a Michigan venison resource. And in it, it talks about what we've covered today plus some. It talks about, you know, field dressing, hanging a carcass, skinning a carcass, fabricating and cutting that up, and then further processed products like sausages and jerkies. And there are instructions and recipes available. Like Tina talked about, we also have videos that are coming shortly, and they'll be on our MSU Extension CWD website. And then there's Michigan Fresh storing and handling venison. And that one includes things like home canning, pressure canning of venison, if you want to do it that way. Tina and I are open to questions and discussion now.
Thanks, Jeannine and Tina. So if I put in the chat pod the link to the Michigan how to field dress, Michigan venison, how to field dress, butcher, and prepare guide that Jeannine referenced. And if you have any questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat pod or the question and answer pod. So is it safe to eat a deer affected by CWD?
If a deer has tested positive, there is no scientific evidence at this point that it could transfer to humans into something like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, like BSE, another prion, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. However, the CDC recommends that you do not consume venison from a CWD positive deer or any other cervid as well.
Thanks, Jeannine. Any other questions? All right. Seeing none, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar tonight, and thank you, Jeannine and Tina, for sharing all of your knowledge and information with us. And with that, I look forward to seeing you all next week at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Thanks.